All right, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. We are here with a very special guest to me, if not to you. Hopefully by the end of this, special to everyone. John Welsh, one of my mentors as I got started in music. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, I think we should maybe start with how we came to know each other. And it starts with when my family decided to move to Olympia. And a phenomenal educator and all-around human being, Greg Allison, gave me a phone call. And I'm not sure if my orchestra teacher at the time, John Nardolillo, just told him to give me a call or what, or how he got my number. But he invited me to come to a SOGO rehearsal at Student Orchestras of Greater Olympia, and came to my first rehearsal, and there was Maestro Welsh, and immediately knew that was a place where I could learn some serious symphonic rep, and I stayed and came back for more later. But
What year was that?
oh, good Lord. That would have been 2006.
Oh, that long after I had been there. Okay.
Uh-huh. And so there was that, and youth orchestras operate as they do. But when I was, I think, a sophomore or a junior, I think I was staying after rehearsals to chat with you about, pieces that I liked. I think it was right about the time we did the Dvorak American,
Mm-hmm.
or From the New World.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I asked you about conducting, and you pointed me to a Mozart score. I think it was the Impresario Overture,
Mm-hmm.
and told me to go get a stick and told me some things to do. We had a couple of little kind of small lessons together,
Right.
but that very much got me started down the path of conducting.
Aha.
So that's more or less my experience of you. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to be with SOGO and everything that led up to that? Maybe that's too big a question all at once. Can you just tell us what was your start in music? How old were you when you began music?
5 years old.
5 years old, really?
Yes, I started piano lessons. I had to wait. Now, it may have been 6. I think my mother made me wait till I was 6 years old.
She made you wait?
Yes, till I was 6 years old. Maybe it was. I don't remember exactly. But my grandfather was an amateur pianist.
Okay.
And he had an organist, and he had studied with a piano teacher in Dayton, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
who was the organist at the First Baptist Church in Dayton.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to study with him when I was 6 years old, and studied for about 6 years with him till I was in the 8th grade. That was how I started. It was always just assumed
Uh-huh.
that I would take piano lessons. My father was in high school, was in the orchestra. He played violin and clarinet in the band, so it wasn't without a background that I would be into music. And I always tell the story, of course, and I think you've heard this one before.
I like hearing them again.
Oh, okay. About if I was at my grandfather's house, my father's house,
Uh-huh.
on Saturday, it was always the Metropolitan Opera.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but if I was at my mother's parents,
Was it the Opry?
It was the Grand Ole Opry, or in Cincinnati, they have this thing, they have a radio TV station, WLW,
Uh-huh.
and it was always the Midwestern Hayride, which originated in Ohio, right in Cincinnati, and then after that, that was at 6 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock, it was Lawrence Welk. So I got a rounded musical education. but I it was great to experience at that age things like Cincinnati is not far away,
Uh-huh.
and Cincinnati is a very cultural town. High level orchestra, uh,
Hmm.
and artist series, and of course the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music there. So I was able to see artists such as Rubinstein
Yep.
and other artists, and go to the Cincinnati Symphony. And my first opera, let me think, they had an opera at the Cincinnati Zoo. All right, you had
Opera?
outside. Yeah, it still exists as a different, but it doesn't play at the zoo anymore. But it was an outside, and of course the animals like to chime in
Well,
with the
I think
opera.
the first opera a musician hears, I don't know if it determines much, but it says a lot about what kind of musician they are. I'll let you finish your story, but you won't be surprised to hear the first opera I heard all the way through.
Well,
Go
I'm trying
ahead.
to remember what the opera was. It was a comedy. You know, the usual. There are several operas on the Barber of Seville,
Mhm.
all of that, the Figaro, any of all of those things. I'll
Opera
probably think of
buffa,
it later.
mostly?
What?
Opera buffa?
Oh, right, definitely.
Okay.
And it was my first opera. I
Uh,
didn't see many more of those for a while, but anyway, that was what my grandfather was a patron of the Cincinnati Zoo Opera
okay.
quite often. So
Well, the
yours.
first opera I saw all the way through, and I don't think this will surprise you one bit. We had just got cable because we lived many years with just the free TV, and I stumbled upon the Arts Channel, and they had a live feed from the Vienna Staatsoper, and they
Mhm.
had a surrealist interpretation of Wojciech. And I was so enamored with how crazy it was that I sat there and watched it all the way through. So that was the first opera that I saw all the way through.
Well, I have a story about Bojack too. Uh, in the
Well,
70s.
maybe just for the any students who are watching this, Wojciech is an opera by Alban Berg, and it's wild. The story is really kind of bizarre and grim and dark, which it was meant to do for the time it was written in. And Berg is a 12-tone composer, but he's the more lyrical variety. But we'll save all those things for another video.
At least in that past, in
Yes,
that opera.
yes.
So when I was doing my master's degree in Baltimore, I lived in Washington, D.C. I had to
Uh,
get on a train every morning and go to Baltimore. And I had to be there for my 8 o'clock class,
and at which
theory,
fine institution is this?
Peabody
Of
Conservatory
course.
in Baltimore. Yes.
Not too shabby.
No, not at all. And so they had for our graduate theory courses,
Uh-huh.
had little mini semesters, and things like Debussy, La Mer, Tosca, things
Uh-huh.
like that were analyzed. One of them was Wozzeck. Now, at 8 o'clock in the morning, having ridden the train,
Well,
from
it
seven
may not have
o'clock.
sounded too different from the train.
So that was Wozzeck. I love the opera. The opera is incredible, but it was a little much in the morning at 8 o'clock after riding the train
Uh-huh.
Baltimore to Washington. Yes, so
Well, your studies in both your undergraduate and your graduate school included some really amazing names in classical music. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of your teachers?
yes. Let's see. Let's start with my piano teacher from the 8th grade all through
Mhm.
high school. And then when I did my senior recital at school, I went to Miami University of Oxford, Ohio.
And that's the the northern Miami, not the fun one in the
the
south.
real Miami, because the tribe of Indians in that area was called the Miami Indians. So that's the real Miami. Anyway, I studied from the 8th grade
Mm-hmm.
teacher there named Louise Erickson. She was a student of Isidore Philippe. And she actually, she premiered the Shostakovich first piano concerto with the Cincinnati Symphony.
Wow.
Way back when Max Rudolph was the conductor.
Yeah.
So she was quite a pianist, quite an artist, quite an effect on me. So that was my piano teaching. Then I also studied with a well-known pianist named Robert Goldsand. He came to Miami University in the summer for a summer workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the type of pianist. He was a long time at Manhattan, at either the Manhattan School or Manus in New York. Longtime teacher there, emigre, as many of my teachers were emigres from Europe in the 40s, the 30s and the 40s.
Yeah.
So I went into Air Force ROTC. It was the Vietnam, and became the conductor of one of the Air Force bands in Washington, D.C., the ceremonial band. And studied at Peabody when I was there just going and working in the class, auditing the class in conducting. The professor there was a man named Leo Mueller, M-U-E-L-L-E-R, not to be confused with Otto Werner Mueller, but Leo Mueller. Leo was an opera conductor, opera repetiteur. As a young child, at 12 years old, he was a repetiteur in the Vienna State Opera.
Well, I had always been so confused by how pianists came to be conductors until I was sort of explained the whole repetiteur situation, where you have a person whom is a very fine pianist, because they have to be to read from a score, to rehearse opera scenes with a soloist or with a group, and then that person either is or becomes the conductor. And, and in that way, it makes very much sense that a conductor would be a pianist, to be able to rehearse and read from the score at the same time.
Yeah, the pathway to being a conductor in those times, in the early part of the 20th century, was to be a repetiteur, and then to become an opera conductor, and then you went on to symphonies, because those were considered secondary. Like the Vienna Philharmonic is the orchestra for the Vienna State Opera, and it's a club that only plays occasionally. It does opera. It's an opera orchestra. So that was the way it went. So he was that. He was an incredible man. He was. There was a great tenor of the early 20th century named U.C. Björling.
Yes.
And he was in this country when he was Czech-Austrian, Mueller was. And he was in, I think that Björling is Swedish. Anyway, he was in this country accompanying Björling on a tour when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, or whatever it was at that time. So he came to this country. He came to be the conductor through various reasons. He also was conductor of the Halifax Symphony for a while. Came to Peabody, was there until he retired, and went back to run the Young Artist Studio at the Vienna State Opera. So that was the first thing. So I studied with him. There was another conducting at Peabody for my degree after I left the Air Force. There was another teacher back then with the American Symphony Orchestra League named Richard Laird.
And
He,
this is the teacher of yours that I think I've heard the most about.
yeah, there's if you Google Richard Laird, you'll come up on a Facebook page about him. I studied in 1971, 2, and 3
Mhm.
with him in Orkney Springs, Virginia, the American Symphony Orchestra League, then called the American Symphony Orchestra League, now called the League of American Orchestras, um, had a summer workshop. So I went there for 3 summers, and that's where I met Sam Jones,
Uh-huh.
who you know from his association with the Seattle Symphony and the fact that he lives here. Um, he was an incredible teacher. I can go into a lot of stories about him, but I think you want a little bit of an overview here.
Yeah.
So then my teacher at Peabody, Leo Mueller, said, you need to go study with Leon Barzan.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a standing invitation to go back to Orkney Springs, but in 1974, 74, the summer of 74,
Mm-hmm.
73, I can't remember. Anyway, I went to Aspen to study with Leon Barzan,
Mm-hmm.
who's entirely different type of teacher than my
Mm-hmm.
other 2 teachers.
Well,
Very,
and even in my experience of going to conducting workshops, the opera guys are so different than the symphony guys,
right,
because the opera people have had to jerry rig their gesture to work for everybody in a way that is immediately identifiable as what they want and when they want it to happen, and dealing with people in a very small area near you, and then people up on stage who may or may not be choosing to look at you. And a lot of these people being pianists, not having played in orchestras before, you don't always get the specified, patterns from a strictly symphonic person. And so the gestural vocabulary is often broader, and I think sometimes richer with the opera people. But the symphony people, and especially in modern times now, the wind ensemble people are very militaristic about what your pattern needs to look like, and having it be consistent, and having an ictus table that is very defined and very small.
yeah, I would agree with you 100%, but you just insulted George Schulte.
Well, there's not
Sir
there's
George,
nothing
yes.
wrong with either method. They achieve the same thing, but they're different routes.
I think that was very obvious with Leo Mueller. Some things he did wonderfully well. His impressionistic music was absolutely phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
His Brahms, heavy Germanic music, not so good
Yeah.
because his he did the Brahms fourth once, and I said, but it wasn't really heavy, and he says, oh, I can't stand the heaviness. So all right, so that was his thing, and his beat was up here all
Yeah.
the time. All
Yeah,
right,
I find those opera people are usually, they're like sculpting clay in the air.
right. Well, I was in Salzburg sometime in the mid 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and saw Carl Böhm do Ariadne auf Naxos.
Not so
And
bad.
yeah, well, it was like,
Well,
I wondered how they were doing, but of course it was with the Vienna Philharmonic, and they know what to do.
a friend of mine sent me a video of Bugs Bunny conducting. I'm sure
Mhm.
you've seen the clip. And I
Yeah.
looked at it, and within 3 seconds, I said, it's Stokowski,
Hmm.
because he's got the gloves and no baton.
Right. Right.
And
So
it's almost a trope at this point.
I
The
I find that, to me, conducting is conducting,
mm-hmm,
regardless of whether you're conducting a chorus, or
mm-hmm.
whether you're conducting an opera, or whether you're conducting a wind ensemble or a band.
Yes.
the problem with pianists, problem with pianists being one,
Uh-huh.
is they don't breathe.
Yes, I have. This is precisely the frustration I have sometimes when I know a conductor is a pianist, and it's not always true. I
No,
think people like Nicholas Coiley, I mean,
no.
he's taken all of those considerations in before he comes into the rehearsal and knows what everybody needs.
Well, he had a
But
good.
sometimes you get the people that they just want they. Why do you have to breathe right there? Why is there a space there? It's like, well, they need to breathe.
Well, yes,
Or are you speaking more about the gesture itself?
yeah, yes, the gesture itself. I mean, it's opposed
Hmm.
to that,
Ah,
as
yes.
opposed to putting a breath in. All right.
Mhm.
So the point is that when I was studying with my teacher, and we called it pre-college
Uh-huh.
at Miami University. She used to sit there, and if I didn't breathe, she'd poke me with her elbow.
Ah.
You know, she always was saying, take the breath,
Mhm.
phrase with the breath, which is what most pianists don't do. They just, they lift their arm maybe, at that a lot, so it's always, that's the problem with conductors. And that's, I like Schulte sometimes, but to me, he's just too, that's his personality too. Was his personality. Luckily, I got to see him a few times with the Chicago Symphony. So,
Well, something we are all missing, and many of us don't know that we're missing it right now, is the power of live music. And there's a story that you've told to me, and I hope you'll retell it today, about sitting in a rehearsal of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony with
mm,
the Concertgebouw. If you could run
mm,
us through that story.
yes. In addition to going to Aspen, then sometime around in the mid 70s, I went to Amsterdam
Hmm.
to study there at Hilversum, which is the radio orchestra of Holland,
Hmm.
at a conducting workshop they have in the summer. So one of my friends at that time was, well, there were a couple of friends that play into this. One of my friends, the Concertgebouw Orchestra, which I consider to be the best orchestra in the world,
Hmm.
all right, came to Washington, D.C. I lived in Washington until 1990. So um, the they came to Washington a couple of times to go to the Kennedy Center.
Hmm.
And one series was all Beethoven symphonies and all 5 piano concertos with Oscar
Wow.
Guzzi. And then they came back another year and did several Mahler symphonies. I know they did 2, they did 5, they did 7. I don't remember
Hmm.
what else they did. But I had become friends with the then artistic director of the Concertgebouw, a man named Hein van Rooyen. And so he said, well, you should come over to do this. So I did. I was staying in his house
In Amsterdam?
in Amsterdam. And so I then had a friend who was a violinist.
Hmm.
I didn't hold that against him. He was a violinist at a freelancer. He had emigrated from Russia. He was the former principal violinist of the Moscow Philharmonic under a conductor whose name is Kirill Kondrashin.
That's a
Kondrashin,
name many of us know.
yes, Kondrashin came to this country when Van Cliburn won the
Hmm.
competition back in the 50s, the Tchaikovsky competition, to perform with him the Tchaikovsky Concerto and the Rachmaninoff
Hmm.
Number 3. So he knew, he had immigrated to Amsterdam at that time.
Hmm.
So he went, he messaged, a very good friend, he messaged Kirill Kondrashin and said, you need to talk with this young conductor and all of this. So I walked into the Concertgebouw to meet Maestro Kondrashin,
Mm-hmm.
who was anything but a maestro, really. He was a very nice person. And he was rehearsing the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. And of course, that was my first time in that hall, which,
Yes, is
if
one
you,
of the finest concert halls in the
oh,
world.
it has such a wonderful sound. And in that orchestra, which has a wonderful sound,
In any hall.
yes, they have to work pretty hard in the Kennedy Center, but yeah. Anyway, I sat there uh, and listened to that symphony, which is one of the most wonderful, beautiful, warm symphonies anybody has ever written, and just literally started crying. Um, it was so warm and so beautiful. And I did have a chance to meet a couple of times with Kondrashin. One of the things, of course, he did many of the premieres, the premiere of the First Symphony of Shostakovich and many of the Shostakovich symphonies. So he had me read, there was a controversial book that came out about that time, supposedly an autobiography of Shostakovich. So he had me read that, and we talked about things like that. And I did get to see him once in this country. Unfortunately, he passed away uh, 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 very soon after that. But that was just the most incredible experience. And in addition to that, the world's premier conductor, who was the music director, who had just left being music director of the Concertgebouw, can't remember the exact timing,
Mm-hmm.
Bernard Haitink
Yes.
came, and I was sitting back in the back. You know, they have rear seating in the Concertgebouw.
And
And so the
his
conductor,
interpretation of Mahler, I think, throughout time will hold up as maybe the finest, I think.
he does exactly everything that's in the score.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Mahler was extremely, like a conductor, a control freak. He had everything. Laid down in the score, and I think would follow that.
And he's just gone back and redone many of them.
Well, he's retired now. He just retired this last year. He did his last concert with the London Symphony. But he
Mm-hmm.
came in that day, and I was sitting back there, and he was doing I can't remember whether it's Bruckner 2 or Bruckner 4. Anyway, he came in, walked down very quietly, got to the podium, put his hands together like this, bowed his head, came up, and started the Bruckner and didn't stop the whole time. He was rehearsing for a concert that weekend or something. I don't remember what, but so yeah, that was quite an experience being there. And then I went to Salzburg on that same trip and met a lot of people there too.
And what is that je ne sais quoi about hearing a live orchestra that can really emotionally move you in a way that a recording never can?
Now, in reality, when you listen back and go over performances
Mm-hmm.
that you've done, um, I've been uh, in the last few years getting all of my tapes and everything on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
You find and you relive some of your performances, or you go to a performance, you very seldom, even in a live performance, very seldom get a true emotional, incredible experience from an artist. I'm not talking as a listener. I'm
Uh-huh.
talking as an artist. I mean, I still remember going to which hall was it? Was it the Pantages or the other one, Rialto. Can't remember. Anyway, Thibaut Day was doing a performance with a cellist friend of some friends of mine. So we went to listen to it, and it was good. And then Thibaut Day did a Chopin nocturne.
And as a pianist, that can hit you right in the gut.
Well, I sat there the whole time and I saw the absolutely perfect curve of the piece. It's one of those times, and my friends, I still talk about that performance. There's seldom performances that really strike you as much as you try. Now, put that on, I mean, when you're sitting in an audience, you're getting input from the performer.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting physical input. You're getting something from them that you can't get on a recording.
Well, a very controversial conductor, Salibadake, he refused to do recordings. I mean, there's very few recordings that exist because he insisted on the philosophy and twofolds. First, that you must prepare a piece for the hall it's being performed in.
Right.
Your tempos and your dynamics are entirely dependent. Like we were talking about the Kennedy Center versus the Concertgebouw.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't even a staccato is a different thing based on those two locations.
Right.
And then further, that as the acoustic reverberation that you get sitting in the hall cannot be reproduced in a recording.
No,
no matter how hard you try.
Yeah, the microphone is in a place that not everybody is sitting in, and it's difficult. Interesting that you would mention the Concertgebouw as opposed to the Kennedy Center. The Concertgebouw Orchestra was doing Beethoven, and I noticed a bow stroke that was absolutely phenomenal.
The scrub?
No, it wasn't a scrub. It was like the beginning of the Eroica, and they would put the bow on the string and they would apply pressure and then they would go off.
Oh yay.
They would fly off, and most American orchestras would just go, like that. You
got to let the strings ring.
Well, and they were pulling, and that was making the sound as much as they could, like the Concertgebouw and the Kennedy Center. But that, those are just little things. But anyway, getting back to your point, recordings are wonderful. Even recordings of live things don't make. I mean, I've been watching the Seattle Symphony's recordings of their playbacks. I'm going to watch tomorrow night with Gary Golson. He's an incredible pianist, and I guess they're doing one of the Brahms concertos. I don't know which one. I hope it's number 2. But
well, it's funny you should bring up Seattle specifically as we're talking about live versus recorded. I took my students a few years back to do an exchange with Paula Ferguson, who I student taught with.
Right.
And so I wanted my students to meet some kids that really have it going on, and they practice hard, and they've got a lot of the advantages that not everybody has. And to know that we could create that for ourselves no matter where we are. But as a bonus, we got to go to see Seattle Symphony afterwards, and I had no idea what they were playing. I just knew we were getting some cheap tickets being a school. And Merlot was still the chief conductor, and they were trying out this new guy, Thomas Dausgaard. And being Danish, he brought out Nielsen's Third Symphony, and I'm vaguely familiar with Nielsen symphonies, and I know they're devilishly hard to put together, and they're even harder to play, and they can be hard to wrap your ears around if you're not ready for, a mix of Mahler, Shostakovich, and Elgar all at the same time.
Well, in your mind also.
Exactly. And they just the first 10 bars of Nielsen's Third Symphony and the precision of that orchestra, that and the precision with which Dausgaard was leading them, was not quite the experience you had hearing the Rachmaninoff, but I immediately understood the relationship between all of those people on stage and the sound that was being created for me as a listener was so special and so profound. And then I've gone back and listened to the recording that they made of Nielsen's Third Symphony, and you can find that on YouTube for anybody to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just as precise, it's just as good. But there's
It isn't hitting you in the face.
no, and you don't, seeing the bows move and the even the wind players in Seattle Symphony, they move together in a subtle but really imperative way that's communicating something to each other and to the conductor. And Dausgaard has a in a very Danish way, a subtle flamboyancy. You know, every Dane aspires to not be noticed.
I don't call it subtle.
Well, he's not subtle in a traditional sense, but he's not exactly Dudamel.
No, I would say not. But Dausgaard's movements are germane.
Mm-hmm.
Dudamel's is not. So.
Well, have you seen the excerpt of him rehearsing Rite of Spring?
No.
And they're going through the ritual sacrifice right at the end, where those time signature changes are they fly. It's almost like why even wave a stick? Just turn on the metronome and hope for the best. But someone who is more flamboyant as a conductor, to see how he handles something as mechanical and specific and as articulate as that, you really see the mastery. He's not just a loon out there waving his arms around. He really navigates that passage with a kind of control you wouldn't expect watching the
Dudamel, you're talking about.
Oh no, I'm talking about Dausgaard.
Oh, Dausgaard. Oh no.
Because he is a little more. He's more flamboyant with the hands, and you wouldn't expect to see him turn on a dime when he's doing something like Rite of Spring, and it's right together, and it's almost like karate the way that he put it together.
Well, that orchestra, after they got rid of
who they got rid
of, has improved tremendously.
Oh,
it's every bit as good as San Francisco.
I was not surprised to learn when they won the Gramophone Award last year over Berlin and Vienna. Not surprised at all.
No, it's really a fine orchestra now. I'll tell you the story about Dausgaard.
Mm-hmm.
I went when he was the guest conductor. He did the Sibelius Festival.
Yes, I remember that.
And I went to hear the first and the second. But to me, at that point, he allowed them to be too far behind the beat. Okay, so I mean, the delayed beat, I cannot stand that.
It drives me a little bit nuts too.
And I had to look away, which I very seldom do. The music was great.
Mm-hmm.
The music was good. So then I watched I hadn't gone since then. I watched the one of the Nielsen First Symphony, much better.
Mm-hmm.
Then I watched the Dvorak Eighth. That was a while back. And the problem with that was that was, I think, in 2017 or 18.
Yeah.
They were still behind the beat. But they were not for the Nielsen. And what else have they done since then? Anyway, they are more, they're more with him now. He's clearer, even though he is like a Bernstein. Of course, you know, I grew up with Bernstein, so this is nothing to me.
Because growing up, my parents I'm very grateful for this, for all the things that they they have or haven't done for me. They always took me to the symphony regularly throughout my childhood, and I'm very privileged in that way. The Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the orchestra played very behind the beat, and it made no sense to me.
Well,
And
there was no beat.
and then when Ludovic Merlot came in, it was closer. They're still behind the beat, but I think there's schools of thought, and he was in that school to some degree. But the ensemble themselves, much tighter.
Mm-hmm.
And then it had been some time since I had seen or heard Seattle Symphony, and I went to that performance of Nielsen's Third with Dausgaard, and he went for that first hit. And if you know those first few measures of Nielsen's Third,
I don't.
It's just give me one moment here.
All right.
So we just had to take a little break there. We were talking about the first few measures of Nielsen's Third is unison, full orchestra, and rhythmic. It's like and perfectly together with the beat right where the baton hit the ictus. And I was blown away to see that from that orchestra. And at that time, we didn't know that Dausgaard would eventually take over.
Right.
And so when I heard the announcement, I knew we were moving in a good direction with the orchestra. Because Merlot is so fantastic, not just for the music, which he's a tremendous, he is tremendous, but the artistry that he pulls out of, especially the French repertoire, and
sure.
even Wagner. I heard his prelude to Tristan and Isolde, and it's as if I had never heard it before. Mm-hmm. And as a conductor, that's a piece I've studied many, many, many times. But maybe the most profound thing that Merlot brought to that orchestra was a camaraderie and respect amongst everybody. Because the backstage staff that I've worked with through all of the different gigs that I've had at Benaroya Hall, they have told me about when Merlot came in and said, you are just as much as part of my team as anybody else out on stage. If you're not getting what you need, if you're not being treated well, I've got your back. And that's the business side of conducting that they don't teach you in conservatory.
Definitely. And that's an important point, that it is a business. Mm-hmm. Conducting is a business. So I have a young person I'm mentoring. You remember Mark Harrell, the composer?
Yeah.
From Tennessee. He had a young student who's going to music school next year, and I've been mentoring him some, and I just was telling him, it's a business, and it took me a while to really recognize that in my development as a conductor. So,
well, I first discovered the business side of things in my coursework at PLU, learning about the beginning of orchestras in America. And for a long time, there really weren't any orchestras in America except for the Handel Haydn Society.
Yeah.
And then
Theodore
Thomas. Theodore Thomas,
yes.
And he started taking orchestras on tours.
The Johnny Appleseed of orchestras in this country. Yes.
Exactly. And if when we get out of this quarantine, I think we're going to need some more Johnny Appleseed mentalities to get classical music to audiences. And there's all kinds of discussion about how to do that. And I was having a discussion with Ryan Dudenbostel a couple days ago, who's the orchestra professor at Western Washington University.
Right.
And on the topic of, children's concerts, is that when orchestras are planning how to get more people to come to a concert, they make a concert that's like prepackaged, and they shove it in a corner, and it's separate from the rest of their season. And like a children's concert is a great example of that. we are going to do Peter and the Wolf, and we'll do William Tell, and maybe a piece by Leroy Anderson. And that's your concert. That's your piece for the year. And we won't see you again until the next children's concert. But the board members of these symphonies are under the impression that somehow that's going to translate into these kids coming to their concerts. But they haven't really seen what the orchestra does. So we're in this difficult position of how do we put on a real symphonic orchestra concert with the real repertoire, the full meal deal, that actually gets new listeners into the concert hall.
Well, there was another business model that also was utilized back in the 60s and 70s. And it was, of course, the Pops concert. We're going to have a Pops concert, and that will draw people in, and then they'll get a subscription.
Yeah, but then they only go to the Pops concert. They don't come back the rest of the season.
And it's a legitimate genre.
It is, absolutely.
But it is not the answer to getting people. You know, this has been discussed. This has been discussed since I've been a member of the American Symphony Orchestra League since the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And the articles in the magazine were the same as they are today.
Mm-hmm.
Only people that come to concerts are people with disposable incomes.
Yes.
Kids don't come. They may go to the young person's concert.
Because the concert comes to them, or somehow they have been, transported.
Well, I mean, look at I've got the whole CDs of all of Bernstein's young people's concerts. And they were absolutely crowded.
Yeah.
Right, but that's New York City. The challenge to me, as I think about this, and I'm glad I don't have to solve it.
It's a tough one.
They're talking now, it could be 2021 until they can have sporting events, and concerts. They don't mention concerts, but that's the same thing. Only more than 50 people. How are they going to circumvent it? How is the Seattle Symphony going to circumvent that issue? I mean, how are we going to do that? How are you going to do it at school?
Yeah.
How is the student, all of the youth orchestras, how are they going to do that?
Well, we are in this position of having terrible fear about the future, because as you suggest, we could be looking at a global shift in every way of life. Mm-hmm. Could have to be upended, ended, some things ended, some things killed. I mean, not people I'm talking about. I'm talking about, programs.
That's a good word.
Or things that we just need to adapt or change, because perhaps we can continue to meet in large groups if we can all learn and maintain, good habits about being in crowds and our own personal hygiene, just on a very simple level. But all of that aside, because that's the whole world's worry is too much for one person, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we just need to take this one day at a time and appreciate what we have. Because right now, I've still got, 200 students in my course load that I can deliver beautiful classical music to, and conversations like this, as interesting or as mind-numbing as you might feel they are. And I'm not setting any plans for the future, but I try to take it one step at a time. And we should all set our sights on what we want. We want to continue to experience classical music in the future. What that's going to look like, I don't know. Will it be the same? I don't think that's something I'm going to worry about right this second. But I know it's something that I want to continue to happen, and that's the conversation that we just keep having every day, every week, every month as we progress.
Yep. I don't know.
Well, I've said it 4 or 5 times on this podcast now, but I think the only person who really gets the concert attendance problem, especially as it applies to right now, is Benjamin Zander. And I'm sure you've seen his TED Talk. And if you haven't, you should go and watch it. And he's a little bit of a lunatic, but in a good
Yeah,
kind of eccentric way,
definitely.
as any good educator or conductor is. And he talks about boards of symphony orchestras are so concerned with, well, if 3% of all people like classical music, can we just move that to 4? Well, what a silly aspiration, just to get 1% more of people. If we assume that 100% of people have the capacity to love classical music, we have a much larger audience that we can reach.
I think that assumption is a little, you know,
Well, maybe not 100, but if we just
50,
open our mind that
30.
under the right circumstances, we can teach people to love something that they don't understand yet.
Well, you see, I don't worry about that so much.
Okay.
Okay, because I view myself as a curator of past music.
Mm.
I have no, I love living composers,
I mean,
but
Sam Jones is doing some fine work. It'd be hard to look him over.
one, um, once that pin is done, and the music is out for playing, it's music of the past.
Yep.
And so it needs to be curated. So I never have been upset at that. I'm not one, I understand, and I can talk to people that don't know classical music, and I've done, I lived 10 years in Tennessee, and I can go back and in the coal
A
field.
surprising number of people do like classical music in Tennessee, I found.
Yeah, well, especially Nashville. Nashville's different.
Oh, yes.
Than the rest of Tennessee. But in any case, I went back into country places. We had a grant to do concerts. And, I can describe Dvorak as fiddle music of the Czech Republic,
Absolutely.
So, and to see some of those kids, you never know. And of course, I also spent 4 years lecturing music appreciation to a bunch of jocks, 200 at a time, at the University of Tennessee. So, I can get across to people, even though I told them this is not an easy class. So if you came in here, just get an easy A, forget it, So, but the point is that it's very important to talk about our art form.
Yes.
But it's not something that you're going to convince. One of the greatest accomplishments that I felt wonderful about was in my class at the University of Tennessee with someone from, I want to say Nigeria, African, very black face, black skin, African person who came to me and said, "You taught me how to love Mozart." And that made my whole time, all 4 years, that was worth it at Tennessee.
Well, opposed to this Benjamin Zander approach that everybody can love music and that we need to change our art form completely. And I don't think Ben Zander is telling people to stop doing Beethoven, but some people are taking it that way. But I just had a conversation with Dr. David Robbie, who is up at the University of Washington now, and talking about do we need to change the symphonic format, and he took the unpopular approach right now of saying, if we aren't doing Beethoven and Mozart and Tchaikovsky and Brahms especially at the college level, we are depriving students of experiencing the language of classical music. And
Hmm.
he described himself in his role as a conductor, in particular, a conductor in academia, of that of an like an art curator, as you were saying,
Hmm.
that I've got my space where I show my paintings, and I've only got so much wall to show.
Exactly.
So if I'm going to present all of classical music and I've got 6 concerts to do it, what art am I going to put on the wall when my audience isn't the people who are listening, but the students who are learning? Because I think that very much changes what kind of art you put on the wall. And it's nothing against John Williams, because John Williams works very hard to get the money that he makes. But if you filled the art gallery with John Williams, I think that would be a very bland palette. And I think you're depriving people of having seen, whether or not they enjoy it, Brahms one, which is, and I am not someone who loves the music of Brahms, but I appreciate on a deeply intellectual level how complex that particular work of art is. The same way that I may not like staring at Manet all day, it is supremely complicated art to consume. And if one can learn to intellectually understand it, we can get past this, is it vegetables or candy, when it comes to music.
Well, it's like I always presented alongside music in my music appreciation classes. I always presented art and architecture
Yes.
because those are equal in expressing what was going on in the lives, in the culture, in the lives of, unfortunately.
Particularly in the Soviet Union, if we're talking architecture,
Right,
and the way that was mirrored in the music as well.
right. So I mean, you're talking about an art that is to be things. Now, I would I would say this. I differ with you. I don't think all of John Williams would be bland.
Well, no.
I think it would be very exciting to some people and very colorful. I would include not Brahms necessarily, but a lot of classical music as being bland and introspective. But of course,
Hmm.
we face the challenge of an incredible amount of stimulation in our
Yes.
life these days, which I mean, think about, I don't know whether you remember me harping on um, some things in Sogo, like, wait a minute, that piece of music, you have the opportunity to hear it. But unless you went to a concert in Beethoven's time, you didn't hear his music. You had to go to the concert in order to do that. But of course, unfortunately, times were different then. It was only the aristocracy, the common folk, did not hear the music. They had their own
I
music.
tell my students that all the time, that if when we play something by Mozart, and if we play it as true to the score as we can, it's like he's alive again.
Right.
It's like we have resurrected the moment when it was first played by the first musicians who played it.
But you also have to gain an understanding. Like you remember me saying, please, when we were doing Mozart, remember, please, that they had ruffles on their sleeves. You have to have an appreciation and a feeling for the different styles. And I think,
Yes, the affectations, not just the notes themselves, but how they're interpreted.
well, and that was drilled into my head by
Hmm.
my piano teacher. And as I mentioned, I had 3 different styles of conducting teaching,
Hmm.
which I utilize. Mueller, who was good at the impressionistic type. Then you had Laird, who was of the Reiner school,
Mm.
and very Germanic.
How
And
many inches was his baton?
well, it used to be, I don't know, not that long. It was a King David 2B, I think, if I remember.
I was having this precise conversation with Neil Varone a while ago uh, about these insane batons that, and he says, well, when you're conducting the whole ring cycle for an entire summer, and you've only got the one shoulder, maybe the other if you're advantageous and you want to go left-handed, but
Mhm.
think about the difference in movement from your knuckle to your fingertip, and now you grab baton, and now the difference in length. So the longer the baton, the less effort you can exert
Oh, well,
from your
that's why
arm and your shoulder.
Laird used to use only his wrist.
Mm-hmm.
Only his wrist. It was like, and the stick, of course, you could be this small and the end of the long stick. And the other thing he used to, one thing that he used to say, whenever a conductor got up there with a fiberglass baton, oh, you're an artificial conductor.
Well, I don't want to break a baton over my hand, so thank you very much. I'll stay away from wood.
But it, that stick was heavy.
Yes.
He used to stand there with his shoulder, his arm like this.
Uh-huh.
This was all you would see move.
Yeah, he shot from the hip.
Right. But heaven help you, and every once in a while he would do that.
Well, and I that's a profound effect as a conductor if you choose to put yourself in a box of expected gestures,
Mm-hmm.
because then when you do something unexpected, it has an exaggerated response.
Right.
I've found in my own conducting, and this is something that you helped me with when the couple of times you let me up on the podium, is if I'm going wild all the time, when I really want a forte, I'm not going to get it.
No, you only have a certain amount of movement available to you. So it's interesting to look at that. And then I had Barzin, who was a Toscanini conductor. It was all like this. So I can use
Yeah.
that.
Well,
I could use any three of those techniques.
as I look back on those videos, and I hope that students or teachers watching this will look up some of these great conductors, including Toscanini, and help me out here, but it's my feeling that the conductors who are maybe less graceful in their gestures,
Mm-hmm.
that it was for them, the rehearsal was where their work was being done. And the performance, at least for the conductor, not for the performers, but for the conductor, was less important than the rehearsal. The rehearsing is where they did their work. And so the gesture being less beautiful didn't matter, because it's not for the audience, it's for the ensemble.
Right. I wish a lot of conductors would realize that. You know, the art of conducting is not as simple as one might think.
Mm-hmm.
It is constantly, you're constantly taking input from your musicians, input from your musicians,
Mm-hmm.
and helping them, not forcing them, but helping them to either change or finish an
Mm-hmm.
idea that they're presenting to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a give and take thing. The one thing that bothers me the most on the podium is when musicians don't present an idea.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't say anything. They're waiting for you to do your gesture or whatever. I want to know what you think.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And
And
I
then
want to
you come
see
up
how
against each other on that, and it's fine.
yeah, and I want to see how, you know, the violins present something, and then what do the winds do to it? I mean, you know, or the winds present something, or the first flute does something, and then the clarinet follows
Uh-huh.
with the same thing. Do they absolutely follow? And if they don't, then it's my job to say, wait a minute, who wants to be the person? Is usually the first person that presents an idea that gets the nod. And if I don't like it, or if I feel like I can add something for that particular thing, I'll say something to you,
Well,
or
and
change my gesture.
yes,
The gesture
exactly. And
I can
a,
change something.
a great example of that, and a young new conductor that I happen to like, maybe you'll disagree, and that's fine, of someone who waits for an idea and then maybe challenges it and then backs away or doubles down, is Kirill Petrenko, who is now with Berlin. There's a great video, and the Berlin Digital Concert Hall is free right now for anyone to watch. So look up his interpretation of the poem of Ecstasy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some moments towards the end where the horns are really sort of blaring, but the trumpets are the main act. And he looks directly at the horns, and let me get in close so you can kind of see the eyebrow reaction. He goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
They play a little bit louder, and then he goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can hear their reaction, and he just with the side of the hand to tell them, okay, that's far enough, but thank you for giving me more. But he presented it first with the question of, horns, can you hear that you could be giving more? And then this immediate, not demand, but an invitation of, would you like to play some more? And then that's quite enough.
Mm-hmm.
And with that orchestra in particular, I don't imagine you want to go around making demands wildly.
Well, it's the other thing, of course, is you're talking about reactions of the conductor to things. Yes, you're always getting input, and you have to be, and you develop a sense of, uh-oh, the trombones are not ready, or the trombones are, they're looking at me wrong, or they're, or everything's all right. I don't have to worry about them. So you can react specifically to those inputs. Yes. And it's not necessarily looking, it's absolutely a feel. A violin section has a personality.
Yeah.
A conglomerate personality that comes out, that you deal with, that you react with, that you react to, and you lead or you let them. I mean, what about our friend Ilka? I mean, working with Ilka was just phenomenal. I mean, there was all kinds of input and reaction there that,
well, in such a different way than I had been taught.
Exactly.
I had been taught this very, flamboyant, you need to show everybody where everything is and give all the information. And Ilka is more so, I trust that you have gone home and practiced, and if you haven't, shame on you. And when there is a question, it's, a thoughtful, quick, concise answer, and the demonstrations are brief and with respect. And he never lays anybody out. It's never, anybody else's fault that something is wrong.
Well, no, but he has such a power and intensity in his leading, his playing, that you can't help but follow it. And as a conductor, you feel that. The other experience that I had when I was in graduate school at Peabody, I was Leon Fleischer. And, he's one of the great piano teachers, but he also did conducting. And he conducted the Annapolis Symphony, and I was his assistant. Well, he gave me a concert one year to do, and I did Barber School for Scandal. He did his first performance of the Prokofiev No. 4 concerto, and I did Mahler No. 1.
Ooh, that's a rough concert. I mean,
Yeah.
beautiful to listen to, but very tricky to put together. Wow.
So this was his first performance of the Prokofiev. He was then going to do it with the Baltimore Symphony later in the season. And to accompany him, it was no big deal
Uh-huh.
because I could feel on my shoulder exactly where I needed to be.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like a hammer, but not quite a hammer, maybe
Uh-huh.
a soft mallet of some kind
Uh-huh.
with on my shoulder that told me exactly where I needed to be with my accompaniment. So it's those types of experience that lead you to understand, first of all, a lot of the music that we do today, Mozart,
Mm-hmm.
Beethoven, some Beethoven. Beethoven was the first that really needed a conductor, perhaps.
Uh-huh.
But most of that was done, via a conductorless group with
Mm-hmm.
the concertmaster leading.
Yes.
I work with a group up in Vermont that is conductorless,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm their music advisor. And the musicians, they're all top-notch musicians. Uh, there are certain things about a conductorless orchestra in a lot of repertoire that could be better with a conductor,
Mm-hmm.
but at least they can do it. I mean, for instance, there was a broadcast of Morello doing a concert, and something had happened that day. I can't remember what it was, but he came on the podium and he said, today, the orchestra is going to play the Overture to Candide by themselves, and walked off the stage. And by Jove, they played it.
Yeah.
Wow,
Uh-huh.
So one of the other important things is to learn when you're not needed.
Well, and this is a lesson I first learned from you. It was maybe the first time we did chamber music with, no, well, it was the first or second year that I had been invited to be a coach or teaching artist, sorry.
No, it's okay.
And there was a group working on the 18 instrument Appalachian Spring.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, can you take over for a moment so I can go handle this? And I started waving my hands around, and you got quite cross with me, rightfully so. It was like, this is chamber music. If you were conducting, it's no longer chamber music.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a big, oh my gosh. And I felt terrible because I immediately understood
Mm-hmm.
how bad a decision it was to start waving my hands. And so to bring that full circle, I recently, with my freshman orchestra, had them do the first movement of the Holberg Suite with no conductor
Mm-hmm.
and memorized.
Mm-hmm.
And they maybe would have played it better if I had been on the podium and they had been, all seated and had their music on the stand.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they learned something more powerful about relying on each other and communicating with each other and knowing who the leaders are and how everybody in a way is a leader. Even the person in the back of the violas is a very important leader for the entire ensemble.
Mm-hmm. Well, when that idea of doing those chamber music things came up, I jumped on it like crazy. And
Well,
so
and I think it made the orchestra so much better.
of course it did. That's my point. We were they, uh, it's awful to have to force. I mean, it took me forever to learn that no matter what I did up here, this was told to me way back when I was in the Air Force. Personnel management is 90% of this job. If you don't have the people that can play, you can't play. And it took me the longest time and a sore shoulder and everything else to realize that I can beat as hard as I can, but unless the people have the sense of rhythm,
Hmm.
and the sense of playing together, that they're not going to play together. You have to develop that. It's better if you run across a group like that, it's better to stop conducting.
Well, and it's not anybody's fault.
No,
It's
it's
the
just
that
where they are at that point.
yes, and conductors need to see that opportunity to be the educator.
Right.
And it's I, I have said many times on this show that you can spot in an instant a conductor who has never been in an education role. I mean, you don't have to have been a public school teacher to qualify as educator. I mean, look at Bernstein. I think
Oh, God.
much of what he did was education, not, the maestro mentality, even though he very much had that personality.
Oh, yeah.
But if you are not willing to assume that when the group isn't doing what you want them to do, that's a moment for you to help them learn to do it, or to at least get closer to what your vision is, because these are the people that you are going to be making music with at the concert that you're preparing for.
Right.
You can't distance yourselves from them in a way that they're playing poorly, and I have nothing to do with that at all.
Well, and the point, the issue is you can only get so much blood out of a turnip, shall we say?
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, you can only do what they can do, and
Hmm.
you can only expect the best that they can do from them.
Hmm.
I mean, it's like going to an elementary orchestra. You can only expect, you can help them, as you're saying, you can help them do more and be more than what they possibly are as an individual, but you can't get any more out of them at a certain point.
Well, and I try to bring that perspective to my when I'm practicing, because
Mhm.
I'm still, even though I struggle with rheumatoid arthritis, I'm still attempting to be a violinist.
Mhm.
And there are days when the arthritis is such that I don't feel that I've, really gotten that much better. But I know that if I'm putting the time in, that at least having put the time in, I'm letting ideas begin to marinate in my head that will improve. And accepting any improvement is is so much better than accepting defeat, because there's no moving forward after that decision is made.
Mhm. All right.
Well, I think we are reaching a point where maybe we should make a denouement for our conversation.
Right.
So I've got a couple of, well, maybe not so rapid fire, but kind of rapid fire questions for you, um, and then we can wrap it up. So my first question is, what is your favorite piece to listen to, but not necessarily conduct?
Now, there's so many I couldn't possibly name one thing.
Does anyone come to mind? Maybe not favorite, but something that comes to mind.
Well, they're also different. Their emotional response is so different that, and a lot of it depends upon your mood as to
Huh.
what you're listening to. I mean, one of my favorite pieces in the world are the Rachmaninoff symphonic dances.
Mm.
And uh, but the Brahms Third Symphony, um, Mozart Magic Flute. I mean, those are all such different moods.
Yeah.
That,
Well, if we can frame this in the perspective of, quiet solitude and maybe loneliness that we're experiencing now, I certainly am. What what piece of art could maybe speak to those sentiments right now and help us explore them, not change them? Because if you're feeling sad and someone puts on, happy 60s music,
Mhm.
it's really kind of upsetting. But if you match the music to the mood, you can explore those feelings. So how might we explore what we're feeling now?
Ah, I don't know that I want to explore it.
But if we did,
I don't know. What have I heard lately that I would explore? I mean, it's just so many things go through my mind, and it wouldn't be necessarily orchestral music. Um,
hmm
I've been listening to, there's a pianist from my era named Alfred Cortot,
hmm
and I've been listening to Chopin
hmm
with him.
oh, Chopin will take us to that place of loneliness. That's for sure.
Right, right. I think Chopin is phenomenal, especially his nocturnes.
Yes, C
Um,
minor in particular, I love.
and it's just like, um, I miss Chopin. I'm not playing the piano anymore. I miss Chopin so much. So yes, that was one question.
Um, what is a piece that you have loved to conduct that maybe the ensemble did not like to play?
Well, the Rachmaninoff Symphony.
The symphony or the symphonic dances?
No, well, either
I
one.
love to play the symphonic dances. The symphony is it feels that it should be for piano and not
Well, of
for
course.
orchestra.
Um, um, Prokofiev, Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, now maybe I'm crazy, but I love to play that.
Well, yeah, but the question is, and I don't mean anything by this, Nathan, but how well did you play it?
Well, that's not what was important to me.
Oh, okay. I know, but that's the I did a compilation of all three suites when I was in Oak Ridge down in Tennessee,
Mhm.
and I had a few friends that said, "Don't you ever do that to me again."
Well, the next question, and this teardrop dovetails in very well to what we just talked about, is what is a piece of music or maybe a composer that you feel is underrepresented?
Hmm. Well, I can find, a lot of instances of single pieces that are underrepresented.
Yes.
Uh, it was funny when with the people out at Central, we did that Spore piece for string quartet, and
Yeah.
they were moaning the fact, but when it was done, they said, well, we made something out of that. I mean, don't get me wrong, Spore, no. Um, I generally, these are people, I love Frank Martin. There's a piece for Seven Winds,
Mm.
and I can't remember the strings. I think it's strings. Um, of course, my favorite composers are Barber and Britten, and I think English music in general is not appreciated as much as it should be. I mean,
Oh, absolutely. Well, it has this Mahlerian quality to it, but with the that sort of English fervor. Walton's First Symphony, I think right now is my favorite symphonic work. Right,
mm,
that'll probably change in a couple of minutes, uh, but it's so unlike and so similar to so many things.
I think Britain is just phenomenal, and Barber, of course, is too. So I
hmm
think those two Bs.
Britton and Barber, yeah,
And another person is Hindeman.
yes,
All right, I truly
Monty
love him.
Mahler.
Yes, that's. Um, it was so funny. I forget her name. Um, she was at the international school. She was a teacher at the international school it's been 4 years ago now at least.
Hmm.
She had her group playing the Britten Simple Symphony. But
Cool. Anything but simple.
yes, yes, definitely. The uh, Western Washington did the Hindemith Matisse der Maler
Mm.
at that convention. I don't remember what it was, and it was a very good performance of it. And I brought that up to her. She'd never heard of the piece. It's really fun. She may still be at school up there. She was studying to get her master's. Why can't I remember her name? She was at Birch Bay a couple of times. That's where I met her. Anyway, she was the conductor of the middle school, the international school in Seattle,
Okay.
which is a city school. So anyway, that to me is one of the pieces. I mean, you always hear the symphonic metamorphosen, but it's a great piece.
Well, I feel like that's the doormat to the house of Hindemith.
Yes.
And it has everything that you're going to experience, but it's almost in small vignettes.
Mm-hmm. Right, and even Mahler, even the Matisse is not that long or that big, and the operas are dug.
Yeah,
I did research on the opera after I did the piece.
uh-huh.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I had to do that for 2 auditions, one with the Pittsburgh Symphony and one with the National Symphony back in the 70s. And I first heard it at Peabody with Mueller doing it with the Peabody Orchestra. So back in the early 70s.
My last question, and I asked this of all of my guests, is if you could think back to a time in your career or in your life as you're pursuing music, when you were experiencing a particularly difficult time, and you could go back and tell yourself something that would have helped you weather the storm a little bit better, or survive it, or trust that you'd get on the other side, what might you go back and tell yourself?
Cool it. You know, there will be other opportunities.
Mm.
When one door closes, the other opens. That's what I've always heard.
My obscure Italian relatives sometimes say, the door might close, but you can make it out the window if you need to.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me. And
thanks for having me.
I hope very much to stay in touch.
Who's going to hear this?
Well, potentially the whole world, but definitely my students. They are cordially required to listen to at least some of these.
Cordially required. I love that.
I learned that from Sven Ronning, and I use it shamelessly.
Well, I used to make the students in my music appreciation courses go to at least 6 concerts.
Well, that's a regular concert season. That's fair.
Yes, that's right.
Well, that brings the conversation to a close. I'm going to hit stop recording. I've got a few more questions off camera, but thank you so much.
You're welcome.